Welcome to the Pan-Pacific. My name is Sherry Sufi, and it is my pleasure in my capacity as the Policy Committee Chairman of the West Australian Division of the Liberal Party to be your host and facilitator this evening. I would like to start by acknowledging some of the dignitaries that are in our presence here tonight. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Ron Nehring, State President Faye Duda, State Treasurer Aidan Di Piazzi, State Liberal Leader Mike Nahan, the Deputy Leader, the Honourable Lisa Harvey, Life Member Jeremy Buxton, the Member for Cottesloe, Dr David Honey, and all other members of the Liberal Party's State Executive, one and all. Welcome aboard. I guess as a starting point, it is a good question to ask why a topic called information warfare should interest you all on a Tuesday night. The reality is that warfare is as ancient as humanity. The hunter-gatherers used to throw rocks, hammers and stones at each other. From the ancient civilizations right through the medieval era, people were using bows and arrows, fighting wars on the back of horses. And in the last 2 centuries in particular, we've seen a rapid transformation in the manner in which wars are fought. And what that's done is it's created 3 frontiers with which all of us by this stage are reasonably familiar. And that is the wars that are fought on land, and that's why we have armies. Wars that are fought out at sea, and that's why we have navies. And wars that are fought up in the air, and that's why we have the Air Force. Yet the information revolution, the fact that we all have the internet, the World Wide Web, and the fact that in the last decade, we've all got these small devices that we carry around with us that often deter us from being able to socialise with the person we're sitting next to, because we're all doing this, the smartphone. All of this has transformed warfare even more, taken it to another level. It's added a 4th frontier that goes beyond warfare on land, out at sea, and in the air. And that's the cyber frontier. Now, the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight, that rather I should say Ron will be talking about tonight, we may not all be experts on this topic, but we're familiar enough to identify that it is becoming increasingly concerning, particularly for Western democracies. We all heard what happened in 2016 with the United States presidential elections. And so it was within that context that the Policy Committee of the Liberal Party in Western Australia, on recommendation from our State President, Mrs Faye Duda, made the decision that we would get this guest speaker across to talk to us about this topic, to explain to us what that 4th digital frontier really means and the challenges that it entails for Western democracies. So without any further ado, the guest speaker is the head of the International Leadership Institute in California. He was formerly a nominee for the Republican Party for the governorship of California in 2014, and more recently, he was the campaign spokesperson for Senator Ted Cruz for his presidential bid in 2016. So would you all rise to give Ron Nehring and West Australian fair income welcome.
Well, Sherry, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Faye and all the members of the Liberal Party leadership for your wonderful hospitality this week. This is my first time in Australia. It's been a very, very educational experience for me. I left Los Angeles on a Thursday. I arrived on a Saturday. I'm still trying to figure out where my Friday went. But nonetheless, it really has been a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I want to thank all of you for being part of the Liberal Party and helping to put solid Liberal Party ideas into action. I came to this topic quite accidentally. In 2016, I had the honor of being tapped to be the presidential campaign spokesman for Senator Ted Cruz in his presidential campaign of that year. And I started to notice something, that in a modern U.S. presidential campaign, the role of the campaign spokesman is to be the person who goes on cable TV. It was not my job to travel with the candidate because wherever he was a spokesman. My job was to go on cable TV. And one of the things that I noticed was that whenever I stepped off of a cable television appearance, all of a sudden my Twitter feed would be filled, with people who were tweeting at me. And I noticed a couple things. One is that many of the negative tweets, and most of the overwhelming majority of the tweets were negative, but I noticed that many of those tweets used language that I had never recognized before, meaning they were in English, but they were so over the top and so negative that, in my 30 years of Republican campaign experience as a local party chairman, as a state party chairman, this is not how Republican activists talk. And so it was really odd in that regard. Another thing that I noticed that was weird was that when I looked at the individual Twitter accounts that were tweeting at me, the overwhelming majority of them all showed the same type of qualities. No individually identifiable profile photo. They only tweeted about the U.S. presidential election. They didn't tweet about anything else. All the same type of hashtags in their Twitter profile. No person-identifiable background photo. So that was odd as well. The third odd thing that I noticed was that, for instance, if I would appear on CNN Tonight with Don Lemon at 10 p.m., there's about 1 million people who watch that show. But sometimes I would not get a very big response on Twitter to that appearance. But if I appeared on Msnbc during the day, when there was only an audience of 50,000 people, sometimes I would get a much greater presence. What I didn't realize is that when I was on CNN at 10 o'clock at night, what time was it in Moscow? Versus when I was on MSNBC during the day, what time was it in Moscow or St. Petersburg? So let's talk a little bit about what was happening during that campaign. And by the way, during the campaign, we had no idea that any foreign government or any foreign actor whatsoever was tweeting at us or involved in any way with the campaign. But we learned later on, after it became known that the Russians had hacked into the Democratic National Committee, only at that point did we begin to realize that maybe something else was going on. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit tonight. I want to talk a little bit about what hybrid warfare is, a bit about what current cybersecurity threats are, and why it matters to all of us. If you have an email account, then this is something that you're going to want to pay attention to. What is propaganda and disinformation, and how is that magnified on social media? Some cyber tools and disinformation and how they are used. How we know it was the Russians and it wasn't simply some 300-pound fat guy in New Jersey. What are the objectives and what should we know going forward? This first slide that you see up here on the screen is from the Munich Security Conference, and it's a visual representation of what hybrid warfare is. Hybrid warfare is something that's been pioneered by Vladimir Putin's Russia, and it blends parts of traditional warfare, such as regular military forces, special forces, support of local unrest, economic warfare. Those are kind of more traditional elements of warfare, but it blends it with these two other elements, which is cyber attacks and information warfare and propaganda. And there's probably no place in the world where all of these elements converge more than in present-day Ukraine, which is occupied by Russian forces in the eastern part of the country, and we continually see all of this being used and directed against the government of the Ukraine, all the way down to the illegal annexation of the Crimea. Here's a quote from the Assistant Director of Counterintelligence at the American Federal Bureau of Investigation. He says, quote, "The counterintelligence threat is growing in volume and complexity. In effect, our adversaries use a whole-of-government approach, pursuing their goals on economic, technical, military, and diplomatic fronts, as well as through traditional intelligence service activities." What he means by that is that no longer is this spy versus spy. In the past, during the Cold War, this might be one spy chasing down another, through the corridors of Berlin. But that's no longer what's happening. Multiple intelligence agencies with multiple countries are using a whole-of-government approach, and that is, for example, in the struggle between Qatar and Saudi Arabia today, we see social media playing a huge role in terms of trying to affect public opinion around the world. In recent military conflicts between the Israelis and the Palestinians, you see the same type of thing. So no longer is intelligence or the work of intelligence agencies simply spying on one another, but it goes well beyond that. You could really sum up what the Russian government did with the American election as hack, leak, and amplify. Hack and leak is one column, and amplify is another. Hack and leak refers to what I'm about to go into, which is the hacking of targeted computer networks and then selectively leaking that information to cause maximum damage to your intended target. And then a separate column, which is amplify, which is to amplify existing social.
When internal emails appeared in July, seeming to show favoritism for Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders among members of the Democratic National Committee, it threw the presidential election for a loop, leading to the resignation of DNC Chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Investigators and private cybersecurity firms have said the highly sophisticated teams behind the DNC server breach are two hacking groups that it calls Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. Private investigators say both have links to Russian government and intelligence entities, and Russian hackers are considered to be among the best in the world. While it's incredibly difficult to tie hackers to foreign governments, cybersecurity experts say the methods and evasion techniques of Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear are consistent with the capabilities of a nation state, and their extensive attacks on national security targets mirror the strategic interests of the Russian government. Russia has denied involvement in the hacking. Investigators believe Cozy Bear breached White House networks, the State Department, and the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff in the past. And Fancy Bear has been suspected of targeting the aerospace, military, government, and media sectors, including in the United States. As for the DNC breach, private investigators think Cozy Bear hacked into their servers in summer 2015, and Fancy Bear followed in April 2016. Here's where the story takes another twist. After media reports came out in June 2016, linking the DNC hack to Russia-linked Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, an online persona named Guccifer 2.0 emerged claiming credit for the DNC email leak. Guccifer 2.0 claims to be Romanian and claims to have acted alone with no connections to Russia. Private investigators challenge those claims and suspect Guccifer 2.0 may be part of a Russian denial and deception effort to deflect security. They say the alleged hackers' digital footprints led to French Internet Protocol addresses, which in turn pointed back to a Russian virtual private network service provider. In the end, not everyone is convinced the case of the DNC breach is cracked.
So the two entities which were referred to in that video from the Wall Street Journal are referred to as APT 28 and 29 by the American cybersecurity community. APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat, or a hacking group. APT 28, codename Fancy Bear. I didn't come up with these terms, so please don't hold me responsible. Fancy Bear refers to the intelligence wing of the Russian Armed Forces, and APT 29 refers to the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, FSB, which is the successor agency of the KGB. And I'll walk, and a little bit later in the presentation, I'll walk through some of the techniques that they use. Cyber espionage tactics include something called phishing or spear phishing, malware, and something called zero-day attacks. Zero-day attacks are more rare, and they involve exploiting a weakness in, for example, Microsoft Windows or in various computer operating systems before the manufacturer is able to patch them. Phishing and spear phishing is the most common way that cyber espionage hackers gain access to a targeted computer system. Spear phishing is when someone targets a particular individual. Phishing refers to if I send the same rigged email to everyone in the room, that's phishing. If I send one to you, then that's spear phishing, if I specifically target you. So here is the email, the exact email that was sent to Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. So the email is given the appearance that it comes from Google, and it reads, "Someone has your password. Hi, John. Someone just used your password to try to sign into your Google account, johnpodesta@gmail.com. Here are the details. Saturday, the 19th of March. Here's an IP address, blah, blah, blah. Location, Ukraine. Google stopped this sign-in attempt. You should change your password immediately." And then there's a link to change password. This email is fake. This email did not come from Google, because this link, if you click on that box, does not go to a Google address. It goes to another address that takes the user to a spoof Google page to, quote, change your password. John Podesta forwarded this email to someone else in his office asking, his assistant forwarded it on, asking that person, should we do this? And in perhaps the most unfortunate typo in American political history, the response came from that person saying, Sarah, meaning John's assistant, this is a legitimate email. He meant to say this is an illegitimate email. So the email actually read, this is a legitimate email. John needs to change his password immediately and ensure that two-factor authentication is turned on in his account. So in fact, because of the typo, he clicked on this, he, quote, changed his password. And what really happened is he was taken to a phony site. He went through the process of changing his password, which of course requires first typing in your old password. That information is immediately sent to the hacker. They then go to your account, type in the name and the password, gain access, and what's the first thing that they do? They change your password. And then while you're trying to get back into your account, they exfiltrated all of his emails going back years. Now keep in mind that with Google, they advertise you never again have to delete an email because all Google emails are archived, not deleted. So every single email that Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman had ever sent or received was sitting in his account and had been exfiltrated to Moscow. That's what happened. So spear phishing can also be used to deliver malware into a target system. That is, this same technique can be used to install software on your computer or someone else's computer that then provides ongoing access to your computer even after you reboot it and so on and so forth. Here's an example of such an email that was sent to me. So here, this email is of course attempting to look legitimate. It's from FedEx, must be real. However, you'll notice that this isn't the most sophisticated email ever sent. Notice the poor use of the English language. Your package has been delivered for tracking. Notice also the improper capitalization of the word tracking. Here's a ship date. Oh, I should click on this to track my parcel. Oh, and by the way, where is it coming from? It's coming from the Office of Unclaimed Funds of the New York State Controller's Office in New York. I'm getting free money. They're sending me a check. I should click on that right now. However, if you look a little bit further, here's who it came from. And it starts to look immediately suspicious. It comes from info@notifications.com. That's not where FedEx notifications come from. And if you hover the mouse above that link which says track parcel now, look at where the link takes you to. It doesn't take you to a FedEx.com site. It takes you to this particular address, which is not a FedEx site at all. So this is designed to make it to entice the user to click on that link. And then if you go and click on that link, you will find that your computer has been installed with malware. Here's another example that was sent to me. So Office 365, there's a logo built right in here. This is my actual email address, dearron@ronnehring.com. There are 23 new messages in your email quarantine since you received your last notification. Again, notice the poor use of the English language and the improper capitalization. Messages will automatically be removed from the quarantine after 24 hours. These spear phishing emails are designed to create a sense in you of urgency. Oh, I better click on this right away or else I'm going to lose that valuable offer from Saks Fifth Avenue or whatever. To see all quarantine messages, view your email quarantine or continue below. Well, if you look a little bit more carefully, if you click through on the top of my Apple iPad, oh look, it came from me to me. Okay, well maybe that's legit. But then if you click again, look where it came from. If you click one more time, look at where it came from. It came from ronnehring.com-quarantine inbound at marsoft.com. Not Microsoft.com, but marsoft.com. That is a spoof email domain designed to look at quick glance like it's something that's legitimate when in fact it's not. And if you hover on over this link, view your email quarantine, it takes you to a website called vnpelectricals.com. Right? That is the web domain, which if you click on that, you're going to have malware delivered to your computer. What you find is very often used by people engaged in this type of hacking It's what's called typo squatting. Here are legitimate web domains on the left. And here are spoofed domains that have been created by the Russians as part of hacking campaigns. Notice the spelling. You'll see things like accounts.google, but instead of an O, it's a 0, right? Or from the government of Albania, it's qov.al instead of gov.al, which at quick glance, that little type in the address bar of your web browser might just look legitimate. So this is a practice called typo squatting, and it's very frequently used to make emails that are not legitimate appear legitimate. There are multiple types of malware that wind up getting delivered onto targeted computers. Viruses, Trojans, remote access tools. A remote access tool is a piece of software that's put onto your computer so that even after you reboot it, even after the network is rebooted, that provides ongoing access to the hacker. Then there's ransomware, which ransomware is kind of a relatively new phenomenon. Ransomware will go in and encrypt all of your documents so that you can't access them, and then it will pop up on your screen, all of your documents have been encrypted, send us $300 and we'll send you the key to unencrypt it. That's called ransomware. And then there's spyware, which can transmit back to the hacker things such as your keystrokes or your camera or your microphone feed. So all of these techniques have been used by the Russians as well as other hostile intelligence agencies. There's a list of some of the common malware tools that have been used by the Russians. Another tactic is to use attachments that are maliciously designed. So be very, very careful with what type of attachments you open on your computer. Here's a list of from a report that was written by an American cybersecurity firm. Here's the year, and here's the name of the document that was attached. Oh, look, South Africa Ministry of Foreign Affairs document, defense attaches in Turkey, Apparent Reason magazine article sent to journalists. These were all used in spear phishing attempts directed at various NATO targets, either at NATO itself or defense ministries or defense officials, etc. Notice that the subject that's used is something that's designed to appeal to the senders in the defense sector. How this works is someone creates a spear phishing email with what's called a document exploit, meaning they create a document that's like a Word document, but it includes some bad code in it so that when you open it, boom, it goes to the internet, it pulls down a second piece of software, installs it on your computer, and that's called a second stage. So that's a little bit of an idea as to how malware works. And malware was used in the hacking of the Democratic National Committee, and the types of malware that were used are the exact same tools that have been identified as having been used by the Russians before. So malware can be delivered, as I said, either as an attachment or through a link. So if you receive an email from your bank that says, your account has been compromised, your account is locked, you need to reset your password as a security precaution, click on this link. If you're concerned that your account might be compromised, don't click on the link. Open the browser and go to your bank's website directly, but don't click on the link. You see what I'm saying? So if you type in, if you bank at Bank of America, which I don't imagine anyone does, but you would type Bank of America, there's one person, okay, good, one customer here. You would type bankofamerica.com in the browser of your window, don't click on the link and whenever you receive that at all. And many banks nowadays will specifically not include a link at all in an email saying, please visit our website and make the changes, etc. Here's a quote from an indictment that was handed down by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, who was investigating all of this. Quote, by in or around April 2016, the conspirators, which is the Russians, had also hacked into the computer networks of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the Democratic National Committee, and the Democratic National Committee. The conspirators covertly monitored the computers of dozens of DCCC and DNC employees, implanted hundreds of files containing malicious computer code or malware, and stole emails and other documents from the DCCC and the DNC. This is a graphical representation of what happened. On the left side of the screen, you have the adversary's computer network. On the right side of the screen, you have the victim's computer network. And in the middle, you have the internet. So starting from left to right, the bad guys use their network to access the internet. They craft an email with a malicious link or a malicious attachment. They send it to the recipient, who then clicks on the link or opens the attachment. That then takes them to a website that looks legitimate. They enter their credentials. Oh, I better change my password right away. They're entering it into a website that looks like it's Google or looks like it's Microsoft or looks like it's something legitimate. They're actually sending it to the bad guys, who then use that password right away, extract the information out, and they might install malware or malicious files to give them continuous access to the target, which they do. Then they gather the information and they exfiltrate it out through the internet and back to their network, where they curate it and do things with it. That is what happened to the Democratic National Committee and numerous other targets in the United States in 2015 and 2016. The second pillar of what the Russians did is the Amplify campaign. Again, Amplify refers to taking existing social tensions and trying to play us off against one another. And this involves the weaponization of social media for propaganda and disinformation purposes. This approach is not anything new. Here's a quote from a book written about the KGB during the Cold War. Service A, which was a part of the KGB, the range of active measures against the Reagan administration included the dissemination of forgeries as well as hostile propaganda. The center maintained a large collection of official letterheads and the signatures of prominent Americans and other Western leaders, which could be used with scissors and tape to construct forged letters in photocopy form. The forgeries were of two kinds. Some were silent forgeries that were shown in confidence to third world leaders to alert them to imaginary imperialist plots, and others were intended to promote media campaigns. No different, except the technology has changed. And the technology, social media, allows the stuff to spread much more quickly than ever before. Here we see some headlines referring to the fact that the Russians hacked successfully the computer networks of 26 American states that relate to conducting the election, tallying election results, so on and so forth. There's no evidence that anyone changed any election results, but 26 states had their computer systems penetrated by the Russians, according to our intelligence agencies. Quote, they want to essentially erode faith in the U.S. government and U.S. government interests, said Clint Watts, a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, who along with two other researchers has tracked Russian propaganda since 2014. This was their standard during their Cold War, and the problem is that this was hard to do before social media. Social media has changed the game. So let's take a look at some of the tools that were used both to leak damaging information and to amplify social tensions. This is a picture of the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia. This was set up following 2011, when there were a series of anti-government protests in Russia. And following those protests, which were organized largely online, it was an objective of the Putin government to, quote, get control of the internet. And so in Russia, they started to do things like having mandatory registration of bloggers, blacklists, media platforms were brought under Kremlin control, and scores of troll operations were established throughout Russia to, quote, get control of the internet. Meanwhile, Putin called the internet a CIA project. And what happens with a lot of these propaganda efforts, it becomes difficult to separate fact from fiction. Very often the propagandists don't want you to believe in something, they want you to believe in nothing. And that everything is treated with skepticism, everything is a lie, nothing can be believed anymore, etc. Let me show you a couple of examples of products, the work product of the Internet Research Agency. One of 470 pages that were established on Facebook, one of them was called The Heart of Texas, which I paid special attention to after the fact in terms of this one caught my attention because I had worked for a senator from Texas, Senator Cruz. Keep this in mind. These guys created 470 fake Facebook pages. not Facebook accounts, but pages. You know, if you create a page for your group or organization, that type of thing. 470. This one in particular drew 244,000 likes. They got those likes through paid advertising, which they paid for with what's called cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. So what are some of the things that would be put out on this Heart of Texas website? Well, one of them is separatism. Here's one post from the Heart of Texas. We were so much better off as the Republic of Texas. Our ancestors didn't shed their blood for nothing. It's time to claim back our land. This is consistent with what we see Russia propaganda outlets promoting separatism in the United States. By the way, Texas is not going anywhere. But the Russians backed a separatist effort in California and one in Texas. If you recall, Vladimir Putin said that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was not the Holocaust, was not World War II, was not World War I, but was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Right? So you see a common thread in terms of promoting separatism in the West. Russian troll farms have been active in promoting Caledonian separatism in Spain, or Bavarian separatism in Germany, or the Scottish independence vote in the UK. This is not new. Anytime the Russians can promote separatism in the West, they do that because it turns us against one another. Now, some of these geniuses were not really the best in terms of English. Take a look at the middle post. You know you're at Texas when you go to the gas station and there is a sign in the window that reads, no shoes, no shirts, no service. I have no idea what that means. I've given this presentation like 20 times. I don't know what they were getting at. And of course, so true. I don't know what that means. Take a look at the one on the right. All those in favor of gun control, raise your hand. Right? By the way, these people who work in the Russian troll farm get paid about as much as a typical university professor in Russia. That's what the salary level is like, according to a March 2015 expose by the New York Times. In all, $12 million was spent in this effort by the Internet Research Agency online, including over 3,000 Facebook and Instagram ads, promoting 120 pages and 80,000 pieces of content. Now, this has real-world consequences. Let me point to you something that happened on March 21st, 2016. 2 pages that were run by the Internet Research Agency promoted 2 separate events. One was an anti-Islam rally, and one was a pro-Islam rally at the same place, at the same time, in front of the Islamic Center in Houston, Texas, on the 21st of May, 2016 at noon, a Saturday. So think about that. A Russian group promoting a pro-Islam rally and an anti-Islam rally at the same place at the same time. What do you think the objective was? To create something like this. These are actual photos from the event. It brought out the extremists on both sides. Here you have a guy wearing a white nationalist T-shirt. You have people carrying Confederate flags, more Confederate flags than American flags. And on the other side of the street, you have people from the Muslim community who had responded. The Russians are not for either side. The Russians are for the war. You see the difference? Right? They are ideologically agnostic. There were other real-world events that were organized, including Texas secession rallies. Here we can see posts from that were put out by the Internet Research Agency promoting a series of Texas secession events around the state of Texas on November 5th, 2016. So here's a map showing where they attempted to organize these secession rallies. By the way, we don't find any advertising on issues of taxes, regulation, trade, none of that. Everything relates to race, ethnicity, religion, or separatism, because these are much more emotional. And the goal is to get people riled up and turn against one another. Some of the English shows, this is a little suspicious, so I've highlighted for any of you with binoculars, you can read it, but if you don't, I'll read it out. We are free citizens of Texas, and we've had enough of this cheap show on the screen. Right? Clearly, Ivan needs to go back and get a little more English training. On the right, we've analyzed all the responses and drew up an approximate map for the Texas statewide rally. If you can't find your town, that means you might be the only one who responded in the location, and thus we offer you to join any of these pointed on the map. This is not a native English speaker, or this is someone who ran something quickly through Google Translate. In all, 129 phony events were organized or attempted to be organized through the Russian effort that drew the attention of nearly 340,000 Facebook users. These efforts were not aimed at people on the left or the right alone, because Russian information warfare is ideologically agnostic. The tactics are to antagonize the left and to antagonize the right against one another. Let me show you some examples. Here you have one example of what the Russians produced, clearly aimed at people on the right. And then we have something else that was aimed at people on the left. I'll give you another example. On the left, we find something that was designed to appeal to people on the right. Don't mess with Texas Border Patrol, always guided by God. By the way, that is not the Texas Border Patrol. And on the right, here's something that's against the police, shoots his own shadow because it was black. Trying to rile up people on the left and the right and turn them against one another. Again, we see these highly emotional issues. Second Amendment, gun rights, do you want this to be banned? Sharia law, and so on and so forth, aimed at people on the left, aimed at people on the right. Here's a list of the 10 most popular Instagram accounts that were set up by the Russians. On the left, you'll see the 5 of the top 10 were aimed at the left, and 5 of the top 10 were aimed at the right. American veterans, people of faith, patriots, people concerned about the police. And on the left, for example, African Americans, people in the gay community, feminists, etc. Aimed at people on the left, aimed at people on the right, designed to turn us against one another. Another arm that the Russians use are 2 media outlets that are really propaganda outlets, RT and Sputnik. RT is a television network that is funded by the Russian government, that is a propaganda outlet designed to look like a news network, and Sputnik is a propaganda outlet designed to look like the Associated Press or another media outlet. And these media outlets will employ people in foreign countries. I'm going to show you a video of a woman who was a host for RT who just couldn't take it anymore. And she went on air on her last day, and here's what she had to say about RT.
Last night, RT made international headlines, and one of our anchors went on the record and said Russian intervention in Crimea is wrong. And indeed, as a reporter on this network, I face many ethical and moral challenges, especially me personally, coming from a family whose my grandparents came here as refugees during the Hungarian Revolution, ironically to escape the Soviet forces. I have family on the opposite side, on my mother's side, that sees the daily grind of poverty. And I'm very lucky to have grown up here in the United States. I'm the daughter of a veteran. My partner is a physician at a military base where he sees every day the firsthand accounts of the ultimate prices that people pay for this country. And that is why personally I cannot be part of a network funded by the Russian government that whitewashes the actions of Putin. I'm proud to be an American and believe in disseminating the truth. And that is why after this newscast, I'm resigning.
It's a very brave woman, right? It's a brave woman. So RT and Sputnik, not coincidentally, were also used as part of the Russian denial and deception effort to say we had nothing to do with all of this. So here are actual videos that I clipped today. Oh look, 0 evidence for the claims that Russia hacked the DNC. Guccifer 2.0 claims responsibility for the DNC hack and leaks documents. Inside job, DNC documents were leaked, not hacked. So these propaganda outlets are used to reinforce one another and to continue the denial and deception. But that's not all. There are several independent websites that target Americans and people in the West featuring Kremlin-funded content. One of those is a website called Veterans Today. which is clearly aimed at people who are currently and previously in the American Armed Forces. Now, what type of content do we see on Veterans Today? Well, this website publishes content from, quote, New Eastern Outlook, which is funded by the Russian Academy of Sciences, aka the Russian government. What type of headlines do we find on Veterans Today? Oh, look, blockbuster, Russian satellite proof that America is ISIS. Trump knows 9/11 was an inside job, yet he lies and blames Afghanistan. Breaking, exclusive, caught. U.S. is hiding germ warfare lab near the Russian border. Much of this is designed, again, to erode the confidence of American soldiers and veterans in our own government. But that's not all. They're also fake people. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fake accounts that were created to promote this information. Here's a quote from the American Intelligence Assessment on what the Russians did. Quote, Russian influence campaigns are multifaceted and designed to be deniable because they use a mix of agents of influence, cutouts, front organizations, and false flag operations. Let me give you an example. This post caught the attention of investigators because one of the first that appeared on Facebook promoting this website called dcleaks.com. DC Leaks was set up by the Russians to push out some of the information that was hacked from the Democratic National Committee. This post is from the account of Melvin Reddick, who writes, these guys show hidden truth, not the hidden truth, again, the bad English. These guys show hidden truth about Hillary Clinton, George Soros, and other leaders of the U.S. Visit DC Leaks website. It's very interesting. Posted by Melvin Reddick. Problem number one is that Melvin Reddick doesn't exist. The picture is actually of some poor guy in Brazil who they actually found, and he's like, I don't know anything about this. So, and the website itself was a Russian-created influence outlet. It's one example of creating fake people. Here's another example. Tennessee GOP was a Twitter account that was fake. And what you find with this account is that, like others, a lot of the content was completely natural. Because if the content is all propaganda, that's going to turn somebody off. People are going to recognize that. So here's normal content. Oh, look, mother and daughter, or, this is when Carrie Fisher died, completely innocuous. Then we start to notice things that would never be put out from an official party account. We have two problems: Muslims who keep attacking us every day, and liberals who keep calling them peaceful. No state Republican Party in America would ever say something like that. Then it gets further. Just a reminder, Obama wants our children to be converted to Islam, and Hillary will continue his mission, right? You can not like Barack Obama. I didn't vote for Barack Obama, but he doesn't want anybody to be converted to Islam. That's stupid. Then it goes even further. Oh, of course, retweeting when someone says, have to believe in unicorns to think that Russia changed election results. By the way, no one's asserting that Russia changed election results. That's not the issue. The issue is there was an attempt made to influence the course of the campaign. In all, on Facebook, we saw over 80,000 posts, 3,500 plus ads that reached 126 million Americans. On Twitter, we saw 36,746 fake accounts, over 36,000 fake Twitter accounts that tweeted 1.4 million times and created 288 million impressions. What I was most surprised by was Instagram. They created 133 accounts. But look at what the most popular account did. The most popular account of the 133 that they created was called Blackstagram. It drew 303,000 followers and had a total of 28 million interactions from this one account. So how can these information warfare tools be used? To what end? They could be used for 5 things: disinformation, destruction, disruption, extortion, and surveillance. Let me give you a few examples. Extortion and blackmail. This was not done by the Russians. This, in 2014, Sony Pictures was hacked by North Korea. This was in response to a movie, which was really not very funny and not very good, called The Interview, that involved 2 comedians assassinating the leader of North Korea. They hacked into the system. They used malware aimed at gaining entry and obtaining data and destroying hardware. And then they released all types of emails in an attempt to destroy the company. Their demand was that Sony not release this movie. You know what happens? The theaters, which are independently owned, were so scared by what they saw that they refused to show the movie. So this information warfare effort achieved its objective. Here's another example from North Korea. In 2017, over 230,000 computers were infected on day one of this ransomware being spread through the internet, which was a typical type of ransomware like I described earlier. The software is installed on your computer without your knowledge. It encrypts all your files so you can't access them, all your pictures, all your personal financial, all your information, etc. And then you have to send $300 through Western Union to some account somewhere in order to get a decryption key back, which, by the way, they will send you because they want the word to get out that if you pay the money, that you can get your files back. And this was ultimately traced back to North Korea. Surveillance and disruption. In 2015, the French television channel TV5 Monde was taken off the air for 3 hours on August 9th of that year. This was conducted in the name of the cyber caliphate. It was really done by the Russians. It destroyed $5.6 million worth of equipment, and it added $3.4 million in new annual additional expenses to the television channel. The intelligence community concluded that this was done to see that in a time of war, could the Russians take down a television network? And they concluded that they in fact could. Surveillance and disruption, we saw this during the DNC hack. The chairwoman of the Democratic Party was forced to resign the weekend before their national convention as a result of the leaking of information. So we see, here's how this all progressed. On the top, we see the Hack and Leak campaign. On the bottom, we see the Amplify campaign. Here's who was hacked. These three entities on the part of the Democrats. Raw data was stolen. Somebody curated it. In other words, if you download a terabyte worth of data, someone's going to go through it, and they have to have a political eye to see what's useful and what's not. We're not really sure who did that. Then that curated data was fed out through DC Leaks as well as WikiLeaks, which serves as an outlet for Russian intelligence, and from there to news media and websites. Concurrently, there was a denial and deception effort. What the video that I first showed you said was that as soon as an article was published in the Wall Street Journal on day one, identifying the Russians as responsible, all of a sudden some brand new account shows up called Guccifer 2.0 and says, no, I did it here, I'm in Romania, I'm all alone, don't look at anyone else, I'm the one who did it, I'm the one who did it. Well, that's not what happened. That was part of the denial and deception effort. At the same time, you have this Amplify campaign with highly charged content on race, religion, ethnicity, and separatism being put out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and the like. Another objective, another way in which this can be used is for disinformation. Now, I want to show you a pretty amazing video. This video, you're going to have to see the subtitles. So if you're in the back of the room, I apologize. I'll explain what it is afterward. This video is a clip from a Russian news broadcast. And to set it up, this news broadcast is going to talk about an amazing new weapon that the Russians have perfected and its impact on an American destroyer that was in the Black Sea. This is in Russian, but it's subtitled in English. Let's see what they have to say.
Российским специалистам за последние годы удалось сделать невероятный прорыв. Это стало ясно после эпизода, который произошел в Черном море ровно 3 года назад. Тогда российский фронтовой бомбардировщик Су-24 несколько раз облетел американский эсминец Дональд Кук, оснащенный самой современной системой ПВО «Иджис». Вот как описал эти события в соцсетях один из членов экипажа эсминца.
Мы вели русского локатором до его подхода к зоне поражения, чтобы затем накрыть. Но когда он вошел в эту чертову зону, началась мистика. Первыми погасли наши локаторы, и весь Иджис вышел из строя, и гордость нашего флота превратилась в наш позор.
Американские военные не знали, что российский самолет оснащен новейшим комплексом радиоэлектронной борьбы «Хибины». Как только летчик понял, что его обнаружили, он включил аппаратуру, и мощные радиоэлектронные волны вывели из строя все системы корабля.
So the Russian news story says that in a confrontation in the Black Sea that the Russians have installed on an aircraft, an Su-24 fighter aircraft, a device which can knock out all of the electrical systems of a target ship. Okay? And
Российским специалистам
that news then was carried, here's Sputnik, right, which is the Russian news outlet, propaganda outlet. This is in the German language version, which carried that same story. That's pretty amazing. The Russians have this device they can install on an aircraft, and it flies over a ship. Somebody flips on a switch. The system is called Hibini, and it all of a sudden disables the ship. The only problem with that news is that it's completely fake. There is no such device. There is no such capability. This does not exist. This is completely made up and invented, okay? Completely false. Yet, look at all the different places where that story ran. This is one false story that initially ran on one Russian news outlet. It's picked up, it's retransmitted by two other Russian outlets, and then the British tabloids pick it up because they'll write about anything, right? Aliens or Elvis or whatever, right? And then from there, Fox News picks it up, and it runs all over the place. And look at this. The original story ran on April 15th of that year, and the story was still running a week later. All the different places where that story was picked up, even though it's completely false. So how do we know that what the Russians did in 2016 in America, that it was them? How do we know it was them? Well, all of these American cybersecurity companies, which are some of the best in the world, Threat Connect, CrowdStrike, FireEye, they all drew the same conclusion. Because they know the tools that the adversary uses, and these were the exact same tools. If you were to believe that it was someone other than the Russians, then all of these entities have to be lying or are wrong, and they're not. Because this is also confirmed by the intelligence agencies of other countries which have run into the same thing. So here's how we really know. First, the first Western intelligence agency to penetrate these guys was actually the Dutch. You know why it was the Dutch? Why did they have an interest in this? Because what did the Russians do with a certain Malaysian Airlines flight that had taken off from Amsterdam, right? MH Flight 17, which was shot down using a Russian anti-aircraft missile over the Ukraine. So it turned out that the Dutch had noticed that someone in Moscow was attempting to hack into the Dutch Air Traffic Safety Board. And so they sent their intelligence guys, and to their credit, penetrated the Russian military intelligence group, and the Dutch were the first to alert the American FBI that this hacking group had penetrated the Democratic National Committee. Number two, in September 2015, when the FBI had alerted the DNC that their system had been compromised by the same hacking team that had penetrated the White House, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the State Department. In November 2015, they noticed this again and had detected that the DNC's network was, quote, calling home to Moscow, meaning they can detect that the IP addresses associated with the DNC network was sending a lot of information to Moscow, and the Democrats might be a bunch of leftists, but they're not sending information, to Moscow, not on purpose anyway. In April of 2016, CrowdStrike, the American cybersecurity firm, independently identified the source of the DNC intrusion as Russian because they used the same tools and techniques that APT28 had used. Further, APT28 targets political parties, security organizations, governments, and militaries that are aligned with the West, such as the OSCE, Germany's CDU, which is the party of Angela Merkel, NATO, the Afghanistan Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the German Bundestag, and on and on and on and on. That's something that is in common here. By sheer coincidence, all the targets of this hacking group just happen to be seen as adversaries by the Russians. And they also use a distinct and identifiable suite of tools with characteristics including massive nation-state level investment is required in this. This is not something which just one random guy is going to do in their basement. Number two, they identified Russian language origins of the code, and also that we found that in 88% of the time, the code was compiled, that's computer lingo, but the code was prepared for shipment between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. In Moscow. And previous attempts to hack had been followed by information operations. For example, you recall that the Russians were caught, that were banned from the Olympics due to this doping scandal. Well, by sheer coincidence, these same entities had hacked the World Anti-Doping Agency, and on and on and on, and many, many such examples. So in conclusion, what are their strategic objectives for information warfare? Well, number one, it's to promote distrust of major institutions in Western democracies, specifically government, police, and the media. They don't want us, the citizens, to trust government, the police, or the media. Number two is to amplify social tensions, race, ethnicity, and religion being among the most powerful. Number three is to promote separatism. And number four is to vastly exaggerate Russian military and economic strength. You know how big the Russian economy is? Or to be more accurate, how small the Russian economy is? Russia's economy, a country of 150 million people, Russia's economy is smaller than that of New York City. Russia's economy is about the size of the economy of Belgium and Holland added together. Tiny economic strength. But much of this propaganda, Russia tries to make themselves look to be much more influential. While you may not be a target for Russian hackers, and you're probably not, many of these techniques are also used by criminal organizations and are aimed at the wider public. So you should follow best practices to protect yourself and your organization. If you want to read further, there are two reports that are put out by FireEye. You can just Google FireEye and you can find these reports that are written all about Russian espionage operations and the like. There's also the public report concerning that was put out by the intelligence community in the United States. Those reports are all available for free and they can be downloaded on the internet. I think that's the quickest I've ever gone. Was that interesting for you? Okay, thank you very much. I'll turn it over for questions.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Ron, for a fascinating presentation. You've obviously sat patiently and listened to what Ron has had to say. We want to give you the opportunity to be a part of the conversation. So you're allowed to disagree, of course, that in the spirit of free speech. Don't expect everybody to find everything that's been said tonight convincing. Keep it respectful, keep it short, don't make speeches, ask questions. And before we get on with all of that, if I can just say one thing, since I've taken over the chairmanship of the policy committee, we have never put a per head cost to attend any of our events ever, but we are a volunteer organisation. There are some donation forms on your seats floating around, and you can feel free to fill those out and be as generous as you'd like to be. And if you don't like to do it the old-fashioned way, you can jump online. Don't worry, Russia won't hack into your computer when you do that. And go to waliberal.org.au/donate and be as generous as you like without people catching you in Moscow. So without any further ado, let's get on with the conversation. I would like to probably ask the first question for the night myself. A lot of this stuff people would dismiss as conspiracy theory, okay? What would you say to that?
Well, it's certainly not a conspiracy theory because the American intelligence community, the international, the intelligence agencies of our Western allies do not engage in or indulge conspiracy theories. In fact, there's a very high threshold that they have to achieve of confidence in order to report on this. In addition, the cybersecurity firms that Threat Connect, FireEye, CrowdStrike, and so on, these agencies, these cybersecurity firms are hired routinely by companies in the defense sector, by academia, and elsewhere to protect their systems from foreign intrusion. And so they have a full-time job because there are constant hacking attempts on the part of the Chinese, the Iranians, Russians, etc., that are aimed at the American defense sector, academia, and so on. So another conspiracy, theory about this. And as for whether anybody was conspiring with anybody else on the Russian side, that's a matter that's under investigation. That's immaterial for this purpose. Furthermore, our friends in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, in Ukraine, in the former Warsaw Pact countries, this was no surprise to them. I sat with a group of parliamentarians from Eastern Europe who said, we're amazed or surprised by this because we have to deal with this type of interference all of the time. For example, when Macedonia will now be joining NATO. They've been delayed because of a fight with Greece over the word Macedonia. But when Montenegro joined NATO, there was a similar type of effort to disrupt, their internal politics as well. So there's not a conspiracy theory about this. This is documented.
Sure. Let's go to a question from the audience. So we have Vince Colley at the back with a microphone, and he'll be running that around. So if you put your hand up, I'll make a note in my head of the order in which your hands went up, and then we'll try our best to come around to it. We'll start with, is it David Strafacci?
Yes.
Yep.
I had the recently in a business trip, I watched Russia TV and CNN. So the first time I've ever watched Russia TV, and I haven't watched CNN in a long time. But the Russia TV had better news. And the question is like, in terms of, you talk about divisiveness in America, and I was watching what, the anti-Americanism that was coming through from CNN, which one actually has a bigger impact on America? The people that are, dare I say, useful idiots, as Lenin would call them, or the actual Russians?
Well, that's outside of the scope of this presentation. This is not a criticism or a critique of the American news media. And having been a presidential campaign spokesman for a conservative Republican, I have plenty of opinions about the American news media. But that's not the issue. The issue here is they have a hostile foreign government that engaged in a multi-year effort to interfere with our internal democratic process through fraudulent means. That is an issue that we have to be aware of. So we can bury our head in the sand and say, well, we just don't like the liberal media and therefore engage in a lot of whataboutism. But that doesn't really raise the sensitivity of the fact that we have to be more careful as people using social media before we share some stuff on, on Facebook and Twitter and so on. I mean, how many times have you seen information that's shared by someone and it's clearly wrong? It's clearly fake, right? People put this type of stuff up on the internet all the time, and we have to be more careful about that. So I'm happy to, by the way, I had such a great time here in Australia. I'd love to be invited back. We can do a whole separate presentation on all the problems with the American news media. We could throw the Australian news media in it at the same time, but that doesn't change the fact that this is a real issue that we have to be concerned about.
Up the front here, please.
Hi, Lisa Morgan. I'm actually Ukrainian by descent. 15 years of research to do with Soviet Ukrainian history. I just want to make a public thank you to the Americans for actually taking up the cause on behalf of Ukraine. What's happening over there, you would just not believe. And I just want to thank you, Ron, for this. I constantly say that that Australians have just got their head in the sand. You need to talk to my 94-year-old mother, who is very up with the latest news, and get an understanding of what it's like dealing with Russians. I have a very dear friend who was in the military, and way back in his day, he was there to protect and keep an eye on the Russian spies over East. He said there were more Russian spies than there were military to actually look after them. And I come out of the university sector. I have had to fight our own administration within my particular alma mater. We had a presentation a few years ago.
Sorry, not trying to be rude. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I actually want to ask, how do we stop this in this country? It's here. You've got your head in the sand if you think it's not. What do we do? You guys haven't been able to sever any of this. Cyber security, there is no security. So how do we actually get onto this?
Yeah, a few suggestions. Number one, concerning Ukraine, we should be aware that one of the objectives of the Russians is to prevent anyone else from joining NATO. Right? So, for example, when the Russians left Austria in the 1950s, it was only on the conditions that the Austrians agree that they never join NATO. So NATO has been something the Russians have been trying to break since its formation with the signing of the NATO treaty. And NATO has a rule that says that if any country that has an existing border dispute may not enter the alliance. Well, it's not a coincidence that the Russians have troops in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Moldova, that prevents those countries from joining NATO, right? So there is an objective there. With respect to what we can do, number one, even though the Russians are probably not going to try to hack anybody in this room, chances are you receive or will receive one of these spear phishing type emails. So number one, if we've accomplished anything, please be careful about the emails that you receive and be very careful about opening attachments or clicking on a link. Personally, I receive at least 10 spear phishing email attempts a week at my ron@ronnehring.com account. Amazingly, when I appear in the news media, the number of attempts goes up. I'm sure it's totally a coincidence. But we have to be careful about what we click on and attachments we open. That's number one. Number two is we should be careful about what we share on social media, particularly if it sounds outrageous. Because bad guys thrive on promoting kind of wacky stuff that gets people all riled up and so on and so forth. And number three, our governments have to be aware of this, which they are. And the fourth point is the social media companies have to do a better job in terms of being serious about clamping down on fake accounts and fake pages and all of this. And to their credit, they have started to do that. So there are things that we can do, and there are things that our government can do as well. But the first thing we have to do is be more skeptical of the stuff that we see online. So thank you for your question.
So I guess as a follow-up to that, what would you say the Western world's current deterrence capacity is?
To deter something like this is near zero. And as a matter of fact, you can assume that some of the errors which I showed you from those ads, they're going to do a better job at the English in the future, right? And by the way, none of this has stopped. These same entities have been engaged in 2017 and 2018 as well, and driving all types of divisive stuff. They'll get into things like vaccines, other very divisive issues, just to stir the pot, because they have all this capacity that they can use and create mischief with it. So we have to be careful and be aware that they will improve their techniques as we go forward.
Andy Pickford at the front here, please.
Thanks, Sherry. Just a question broadening a bit. You've talked about the Russian capacity and 2016 cycle and so forth. Can you speak a bit about how the extent the Russian agencies are working with Chinese and Iranians and others, and the extent that goes through United Front and other groups in terms of cross-learnings, in terms of building their capacity also for this offensive and behind-the-lines attacks?
Yep. So there are a couple different things that are happening in the world. Number one, the Russians and the Chinese have put aside their traditional differences and are aligned against the West. That's one thing. Number two, China and Russia both have different capabilities and lack in different areas. Russia's teeny tiny economy isn't much leverage, but Russia has a much more powerful military, and which of course they try to exaggerate even further. Also, it's no coincidence that every time in the UN something comes up against, for example, a thug like Maduro in Venezuela, the Chinese and the Russians are always on the same side against taking any action against the thug, because they don't want to create the standard on the world stage that it's okay to get rid of these thuggish dictators, because guess what? That's kind of what they have, right? So there is this, and then finally, they're learning and seeing one another. Now, they don't all have the same enemies. For example, Iran is not only preoccupied with Israel, but it's even more preoccupied with Saudi Arabia. So you can watch as these type of things metastasize and becomes a more and more common thing, not only in global conflicts, but in regional conflicts as well. We are just in the beginning of the internet. We're not in the middle, we're not at the end, we're just at the beginning. And so part of the need is to have conversations like we're having tonight that raise our sensitivity about what's going on. And also at the same time, we have to make sure that our governments are taking these type of things seriously. If Australia is going to make decisions about what type of trading relationship it wants to have with China, it should be because that decision was made by Australians in the interest of Australia, not subject to some foreign entity learning from what happened in another country and then applying those same type of techniques here.
So you talked earlier about how in the United States there was an anti-Islam rally and a pro-Islam rally organised at the same time. Now, I mean, obviously that's telling stuff. although there is a foreign interest in this topic, that doesn't negate the fact that there is an open and honest dialogue to be had on that subject. So what would you advise us as conservatives, as a major centre-right party in a country like Australia, how do we get the balance right on a debate as sensitive as that?
Well, I think there's something to be said for, we can have debates within our society that don't degenerate into riots, right? And so it's incumbent upon people in leadership to set that standard, that that's not an okay thing to do. Typically, you've seen much more political violence historically in Europe than in the United States. Interestingly enough, American political life compared to European life has been less prone to extremes. Socialism, Marxism, Nazism, these are things that emerged out of polarization in Europe, right? So we cannot allow, at least in my country, I do not want to see anything degenerate to the point, where it's okay to commit acts of violence, so on and so forth. But it was very clear from that pro and anti-Islam rally that it was organized with the intent of creating bloodshed, and that other people would, because the news media, would sensationalize it, right? It would lead the news and so on and so forth. And then what happens? Somebody else gets an idea about doing something against an Islamist center, in their neighborhood, etc. We've seen a rise in anti-Semitic acts in Europe. It's not coincidental that the rise in anti-Semitic acts in Europe runs parallel to greater political polarization in Europe. And that type of polarization is something that the Russians would love to see. The Russians want to see a collapse of the center, the political center in Europe, and a rise of the poles, and have people turn against one another. Why? Because then that gives them breathing room. So the next time they barge into a country, we in the West are so preoccupied that we don't have the will or the ability to respond to that.
Indeed. Kyle Williams in the middle.
So, one of the issues with Russian interference, which has come up a few times, I don't think you went over in your talk, was about Russian interference in the Brexit vote in 2016, and particularly in support of the Leave campaign. Is there any concern over Russian ambitions when it comes to the European Union, when it comes to Britain's place in the world, and potential future actions Russia could take with respect to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, so I've been involved in California politics for 18 years. And I'm going to link this back to what you just said, so give me a second. There is no interest in California to leave the United States. I mean, this is crazy talk. There's no interest on the part of anybody in Texas to leave the United States, right? So why is it that all of a sudden these Russian troll farms are promoting Texit and CalExit, right? Which they are creating this online in the hopes that other people will find it and they can ignite a movement, artificially, that bogs us down in separatism. This seems less crazy when you take a look and you see what the Russians did with respect to Caledonian separatism, the Scottish independence vote, as well as Brexit. Now, as a conservative, there are plenty of legitimate reasons to be in favor of Brexit, no doubt whatsoever. But we should be aware of the fact that the overarching Russian interest is to break NATO and to break the EU. The Russians also have an interest in getting rid of the rules-based international order that has existed since World War II, that the United States, and to a lesser extent Britain, was the architects of, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and free trade, and so on and so forth, and get rid of that rules-based order because it doesn't work for them, and replaced it with an interest-based order, where kind of rules don't matter and countries just kind of barge in and do what they want, whatever is in their national interest, because that's what the thug wants, right? The thug wants to be able to build islands in the South China Sea and not have anybody interfere with that, right? And might makes right, and so on and so forth. So yes, we should be aware that promoting separatist movements, even out of whole cloth, has been part of the Russian tactics.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating what you say. I think I'm beginning to understand why we had a Wagzut campaign going about a year or so ago. It's a short-lived campaign, but I don't think we need that anymore. We've fixed the issue, the underlying issue, I think, that sort of propelled it. At the back there, please. Gentleman had his hand up. Damien Kelly.
Thanks, Ron. Much appreciated. My question is counter-influence, or I guess giving the Russians, Chinese, North Koreans, Iranians a taste of their own medicine. Is there any will in levels of government on the Western side to counter influence anyway? Cheers.
Yeah, I don't speak for the United States government, so I don't have any special insight into that at all. My belief is that how many of you are familiar with something called Stuxnet? You know what that is? Okay, a handful of people. I'll tell you what it is. There was a computer malware that was highly specialized that was given the name Stuxnet. It's not what the authors of it called it. It's what somebody in the cybersecurity world called it, Stuxnet. Stuxnet was malware that was specifically designed to tell a Siemens industrial control unit to tell a uranium centrifuge to spin out of control and blow itself up while sending readings to the control unit that everything was fine. This wiped out a large portion of Iran's uranium enrichment capability maybe about 5 or 10 years ago. That's what Stuxnet did. It's believed that it was created by the Israelis. Maybe we had something to do with it, I don't know. But it was an extremely sophisticated operation because all of the Iranian computers were what's called air-gapped from the internet. None of the Iranian computers were connected to the internet, which meant that somebody had to have that virus on a flash drive and plug it into a computer system at an Iranian nuclear facility, and that flash drive had to know to look, the malware had to know to look for a specific type of Siemens industrial control unit. Like, this was very sophisticated type stuff. The point is that that virus destroyed physical equipment in the target of Iran. And I believe that only a Stuxnet level response to these guys is going to be serious enough to get anybody's attention. Absent that, we have not seen an abatement on the part of what the Russians have been doing. And the longer they get away with doing what they're doing, the more other countries are going to kind of look at it and say, maybe we should try that for our own particular interests. So I don't know what's to come in this area, but I hope that we respond in the most serious way possible, because short of that, nothing's going to deter them. It's like, take a look at the sanctions on Russia for what they did in Ukraine. They want to get rid of the sanctions, but right now it's not hurting enough to force them to change their behavior. If you want to impact the behavior of these thugs, it has to hurt. You can't just kind of slap them on the wrist. You need to punch them in the nose.
Okay, Wayne Barnes at the front here, please.
Thanks, mate. Ron, thanks very much. Most enlightening what you've passed on to us. But I've just recently returned from 6 weeks in America, and I'm fairly confident, after being at the Kennedy Space Center, that America aren't taking this laying down, and that they are really working on these special subjects to get a bit of equality into the world and counteract what is happening through the cyber system. The day I was there at the Kennedy Center, they were to put a rocket up with the latest and most intelligent GPS system in the world. Now, things like that give America an enormous advantage over what all this other political stuff through cyber and so forth is happening and what they're doing. But I believe that if you were...
Wayne, do you have a question?
Yeah. The question is, that America are doing more than what Ron realizes.
So I hope that's the case. There was just a report out today that through various means that we have to determine this, the actual budget that has been given to this troll farm in St. Petersburg has been doubled. So far, there's no abatement on the part of what we've seen the Russians trying to do, interfering in America and the West. I hope it's brought to an end, because I think that we in America should be able to make our own decisions about our own elections without foreign interference. Ditto Australia, ditto Great Britain, ditto Spain, and so on and so forth. But at a minimum, we as individuals, whether on the American side or on the Australian side, have to be more diligent about protecting ourselves and our own online security and being careful about what we share online with our friends and family, because we don't want to share stuff that's really been nefariously created and designed to create more problems. Our countries have enough challenges, as it is, without someone else trying to pour gasoline on the fire.
Daniel Earl.
Thank you. I'm going to cast my mind back to late 2015. I remember there was a lot of articles, because it got me on Facebook, from Russia Today and Sputnik about the migrant crisis in Europe. Now, the mainstream media in Europe at the time was overwhelmingly positive about the catastrophe that was coming towards them. Anyone could see it that wasn't far left. But unfortunately, the media wasn't willing to recognise that was mainstream. And so Russia Today and Sputnik were providing an alternative perspective, even if it was propaganda, as we know, to stir up and pour gas on the fire. And in Australia, we have a similar problem. I mean, our own public broadcaster, the journalists, up to 70% vote either Label green. They admit that. We know that it's biased and it's far left. Is it not a bit rich to deny that the media has a role to play in actually giving the other side, us conservatives, a bit of a fair go, so that these other organisations like Russia Today and Sputnik don't just fill the vacuum?
Yeah, so you raise a number of great points. Number one, I'm not holding out hope that we can only win elections when the mainstream media becomes more conservative. If we wait until the mainstream media becomes more conservative to win elections, we're going to be waiting a long time. And I'm 48 years old, and I want to win a lot more elections, before I leave from this earth. I think the point to be taken from the fact that RT and Sputnik, anytime some European is harmed by some migrant, Sputnik and RT run with it big time, because they want to pour more gasoline on that fire. Sputnik and RT could care less about the victim. What they're more interested in doing is getting people riled up about people who've come into their country and so on and so forth. And they do the same on the other side. We've seen Russian propaganda through these outlets try to get African Americans worked up against the police. It's the same type of thing. The Russians aren't taking a side, and the Russians are not doing a service, by any of that. Any more that they did a service with that baloney article, story about the fake, Russian military capability. But certainly, there is plenty of room to criticize the so-called, mainstream media. Positive thing is that when Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, he didn't have the media on his side. When George Bush was elected president, he didn't have the media on his side. Lord knows Donald Trump didn't have the media on his side. So we can win despite having an unfriendly mainstream media. And your other point concerning reporters self-identifying with the left, of course they do. The corollary to that is that none of them will ever say, yes, I'm a leftist. Because to them, they occupy the center, because everyone around them is on the left too, so that must be where the political center is, right? In the newsroom, it's all a bunch of leftists, so to them, they are the reasonable center, right? I think we're kind of mixing two different things here. There are plenty of things to criticize about the mainstream media. It doesn't make any of this okay. And sure, the mainstream media should cover stories more fairly, and that we should do a better job communicating with the media as well. Just dismissing the media as hopelessly biased, we should never talk to them. We had a debate within the Cruz campaign. Should I appear on MSNBC? Now, those of you who follow American media know that MSNBC, is at night is a very left-wing media outlet. So the question was, should I appear on MSNBC? And the answer was yes. Do you know why? Because 30% of the people who watch MSNBC are Republicans. So if I'm running in a Republican primary campaign, Do I want, and if I appear on MSNBC in prime time, there's 1 million people watching. That means there's 300,000 Republicans watching. Do I want to appear on MSNBC? The answer, of course, is yes. Here, do you want to talk to 300,000 people for free? Yes. Then the corollary to that is, well, but the left-wing host is going to ask you a bunch of obnoxious questions. Of course they are. And I'm going to respond with how right-wing my candidate is. And to my target audience who I want to talk to, that helps me, right? So we have to be sophisticated in terms of how we deal with that. But I'm not going to hold out hope, that MSNBC is going to become, Fox News, at any time soon. We have to win with the media that we have.
Look, you mentioned before what's become a pretty famous Vladimir Putin quote about what he laments about the 20th century. It wasn't the Holocaust. It was actually the collapse of the Soviet Union. When you look back at the Soviet Union, if you could hack inside the mind of Stalin or Lenin, some of the Bolshevik pioneers.
And I should have my head examined.
Or theirs. I think you would find an ideal that most people in this room probably disagree with, that you can solve all the world's problems by redistributing wealth from top to the bottom. But as far as they were concerned, that was the right thing to do. There was an ideological basis behind the Soviet Union. They tried between 1917 and 1991. It screwed up. When you look at other universalist aspirations around the world, like, say, for example, ISIS or Al-Qaeda before it, again, most people in this room would disagree with them. But as far as they're concerned, they're trying to convert everybody to the one religion that's going to put them in heaven, right? So when you look at Vladimir Putin with everything he's trying to do, what's his ideological basis in your view? Is he trying to revive the Soviet Union, or is there something else going on?
So I think there are mixed objectives there. One of them is to establish Russian hegemony in its former empire, Eastern Europe, the Baltics, etc. And I'm going to take the word of the people in the Baltics about what the threat is. I'm going to take the word of people in Albania as to what they think the threat is. By the way, I've just watched some information out of Albania. Albania is like the most psyched up to be a part of NATO. And why are they so excited to be a part of NATO? Because they don't want to go through the domination from the Soviet Empire that they dealt with in the past. So one is to expand Russian influence. There's a second objective. The second objective is that a lot of people have gotten very rich in Russia. And what they want to do is they want to take the money that they've gotten in Russia and they want to get it out of Russia as fast as they can. And they want to store it and spend it in the West. If you are some Russian oligarch, do you want to keep your money in Russia where the government can take it at any time? Or do you want to put that in a Western bank account somewhere? Which is why the sanctions on Russia are so much a target to get rid of that, because it interferes with this internal power structure that has been created between Vladimir Putin and the Russian oligarchs. They want to get that money out. They want to be able to spend the money on their yachts and their, whatever they spend it on in the West. They don't want to keep it there. And things like the Magnitsky Act interfere with that. Russian sanctions interfere with that, which is why they're so preoccupied with that. So there's the lofty part about a greater Russia and all of that. But then there's also the fact that they've got a lot of money and they want to get it into the West, and they need relief from the sanctions in order to be able to enjoy the wealth that they've extracted from their crumbling economy.
But again, that reinforces my point that they're trying to do that without an ideological basis. I mean, it's hegemony for hegemony's sake. Yeah. Okay, good. Let's go to a question from the floor. Can we go to Theo Marshall here up the front? Just wait for the microphone, please.
Why can't we thank you. Why can't we reverse this on the Russians and the Chinese? Because they've got a lot of opposition within those countries. Why can't we reverse this system on them? Thank you.
So if I've understood that correctly, you're saying why don't Western countries start doing this to them, as in hacking into?
Well, one of the problems is that there is an asymmetric vulnerability. The asymmetric vulnerability is that we have elections and they don't. Right? So their propaganda efforts can impact the decision-making of a free people. But it's a really different story because the Chinese government really doesn't care what the people of China think. If they did, they'd allow them to have more than one child, or things like that. So this is a tool that is disproportionately applied to exploit the fact that we live in a free society where we don't have internet censorship, where we don't have censorship, we don't have government control of everything in our lives. We do have free exchange of ideas and so on, and this, manipulates that. Now, that doesn't mean there are other things that can't happen, but in terms of using the same tactics, it's not going to have the same effect, because public opinion in Russia and China, does not count as much as it does in a place like Australia, Britain, or the United States.
Okay, over there, please. Gentleman right there. Your name?
Hi, Tom Dooley. Thanks for coming to Perth. I just want to get your opinion on the following. So traditionally, Russia used its strategic depth through Ukraine to stop invasions, and that did Napoleon and also Hitler. Now what you have is all these countries basing their forces sort of around them in a ring, previous Warsaw Pact countries. Don't you feel that maybe Russia feels threatened, maybe? And that's why they're now using this asymmetric warfare technique?
Yep, so I don't believe in blaming the victim. So I don't think the Baltics are a security risk to Russia. NATO does not have any invasion capability anyway. Does anyone really believe that there's a single NATO country that's interested in invading Russia? I mean, that's absurd. Nobody's going to invade Russia. Why are there NATO forces in the Baltics? Because you have people in the Russian government, for example, in the Duma, who will say that, for example, all former citizens of the Soviet Union should be considered citizens of Russia and therefore are entitled to the protection of the Russian government. What is that really used for? Well, now we have an excuse to invade 14 other countries, right? So NATO is not an invasion military alliance; it's a defensive military alliance, there's no indication wherever. What American politician or Western European politician from a NATO country has said, yes, we're preparing to invade Russia? That's ludicrous. That's simply, the Russians are creating excuses all the time to interfere in countries around them. Take a look at the deception that was used in Ukraine. The Russians denied for years, no, we don't have anything to do with these, independent rebel forces that just, by the way, happened to get anti-aircraft missiles so sophisticated that they can shoot an airliner out of the sky at 36,000 feet. So, I don't think we should blame, the victims here.
Now, a couple of years ago, there was a very famous interview of Vladimir Putin's on RT, in that he's questioned about much of what you've talked about in your presentation tonight. Of course, he emphatically not only denies all of that, but he actually turns it back around on the Americans. And he says, look, you're the guys with 800 military bases around the world. You've gone into Iraq, toppled a dictator based on a lie. There was no weapons of mass destruction found. The Gulf War before that, Vietnam before that. So he says, you're the hegemons, and you have the audacity to turn around and tell us that we're the ones trying to intervene in the world, when yours is on the record, ours is still, debatable. How would we respond to that as centre-right conservatives?
Well, give me 6 hours and I'll start to get through that list. Let me give you one example. At the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, on Christmas Day, 1991, when the Soviet flag was lowered, for the last time over the Kremlin, Ukraine had many nuclear weapons on its territory, right? So nuclear weapons were not distributed in every in all the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, but there were plenty of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine. They also had a nuclear submarine capability as well. So they had land-based and submarine-based weapons, nuclear weapons that were stationed in Ukraine. The deal was that Ukraine would give all of its nuclear weapons to Russia, and Russia would forever respect the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. That was the deal. That deal lasted until a couple of years ago, when the leadership in Ukraine decided that they wanted to move closer to the EU and a little bit out of the Russian sphere of influence. And then the deal changed. Not because two parties voted to change it, but because the Russians decided to change it. So Now, Ukraine is stuck with one of these frozen conflicts with a hostile military force on its border occupying some of its territory, and creating this situation of paralysis. So, I think this should start with Russia should keep its commitments. That's why the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty is now history. Why? Because the Russians have been developing a weapons system, a nuclear weapons system that violates the INF Treaty. They've been violating it. The treaty has been discarded. So the Russians have a bad history of keeping their promises, as the people of Ukraine have learned.
Indeed. Okay, can we go to the front here, please? Richard Stern.
By the way, the Russians would not have been able to do anything that they're doing in Ukraine today had Ukraine retained those nuclear weapons, right? So,
thanks, Ron. Thanks so much for coming, because this has been very insightful. My name is Rick Stern, and although I belong to many organizations, I'm not here representing them, but I am the treasurer of the Liberal Party Woodville branch, just by and by. Question that I have that you may or may not feel qualified to answer. Assuming that you don't have any particular data to support your contention, I'd like you to speculate on what percentage of the American populace believe that 9/11 was an inside job. And do you believe that Donald Trump believes it was? Forget about all the propaganda need. I just want to hear your opinion, because I respect your opinion.
So, thank you. Give that man the microphone as much as he wants. So, I think very few Americans believe that 9/11 was some type of an inside job. There are plenty of conspiracy theorists. There are people who think the Earth is flat. There are people who think LA will have a good football team. There are all types of crazy ideas floating around out there all the time. I do not believe for a second that President Trump believes that 9/11 was an inside job at all. So I haven't seen any of that at all. I get very discouraged when I see people online sharing this type of conspiracy nonsense. When it's so evident as to what really took place there. There are other types of debates that happen insofar as, well, people will argue, well, most of the people were Saudis, and therefore Saudi Arabia was behind that. Well, that's a bit of a leap. Osama bin Laden had been expelled from Saudi Arabia; his citizenship was taken away, and so on. So there are more nuanced debates to have about things like that. I don't believe that very many people believe that. And I, since you brought that up, 9/11, I have to tell you, my very best friend, we've been friends since kindergarten, literally since kindergarten, and he was a police officer, New York City police officer, and he was not in the city at the time of 9/11, but he was called in like every other, like literally every cop who was not in a hospital bed was called on to to active duty, and so he did not. He was not a victim of 9/11 at that time, but today he has an extremely rare form of cancer. He has to have surgery on his throat. He's had some very bizarre issues with his kidneys and such. The throat, it's believed that because he was breathing in all these PCBs and the smoke and so on and so forth. So even though 9/11 was a long time ago, it still claims victims today, that affects me personally because we've been friends since we were this tall. So
yeah, you'd be surprised. How widespread some of these conspiracy theories are in North Africa and the Middle East. They're not very common in the English-speaking West, but the idea that Israel was behind it, or the Jews caused this, or they're trying to destabilize the Middle East because this, that, and the other. You'd be surprised. Some of this stuff actually comes straight off Al Jazeera, it's mainstream news outlets. So frightening stuff. Any further questions? A gentleman down the middle there, please.
Thank you, Sherry. Ron, Jeff Hill's my name. Very interesting. I want to circle back to what you talked about earlier with regards to the main delivery systems, and as you got up there, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, those actual American networks that I suppose that the Soviets and others are using to deliver. I read an article back in December that actually said almost 50% of internet traffic is now bots. And there was actually an incursion 5 years ago where almost over 50% of internet traffic became bot, and they're having problems because their software could no longer discern human traffic as opposed to bot traffic. So it actually got over the 50% mark. So what the question is that from the point of view of the people that are running Facebook, Twitter, which is one of the main delivery systems for people bringing information that's going to be adverse, what is being done by those organisations and the American government to have those organisations put in place sufficient protections to stop such a high percentage of bots being used to disseminate false information that obviously is coming from sources, as you said, Russia, etc.
Yeah, so great question. A few things. Number one, what he's referring to are bots or robots, which are automated systems that mimic human beings to try to drive behavior and information on social media. Twitter is where most bot traffic can be found, simply because of the different nature of the platform. And Twitter is doing more in this regard, but Twitter has not simply outlawed, or banned, bot traffic, on its network. And they've purged many, fraudulent accounts, but there has not been the same type of effort that you see at Facebook. Facebook requires that in order for you to use Facebook, you have to use your real name. You have to, you can't misrepresent who you are, things like that. Twitter is different. It's much wider. It's a much more open platform. So this is a real issue. And the American government is going to wind up dealing with issues about self-regulation versus government regulation. As a conservative, I think the last thing we want to do is put the government in charge of internet content, right? Because the internet is this amazing thing because it's been an open platform. But now you have people like Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, like asking for government regulation so that they can have some type of predictability and so on and so forth. Although we should be very careful about when industry people want their industry to be regulated. There's a tendency, and I'm not saying it's on the part of Mr. Cook, there's a tendency for companies to call for regulation that, oh, by the way, purely coincidentally, will give our company advantage over our would-be competitors. So that's a very good question in terms of what will happen in the future in terms of what action will be compelled by government as opposed to self-regulation. I don't think we have the answer to that yet. I certainly hope that we have the lightest possible touch from the government in that, I barely trust the government to issue my driver's license, so we want to minimize that. If we were all in favor of big government, we'd probably all be in the Labor Party. So we want to have limited government, but we also have to have people who are behaving responsibly and understand the impact that this is having in our society. I don't think we have all the answers yet, but I think that we're not going to get to the answers unless we have this type of dialogue.
Okay, we'll go to the front, Dr. David Honey.
Thanks, Sherry, and thanks, Ron. Really illuminating. It's, I guess, a topical question, but are the ongoing current federal investigations in the US of any use, or are they useless or a distraction, as it appears to be the case of President Trump, or at least the view of President Trump?
Yeah, so I'll separate that out, but there are, Special Counsel Robert Mueller has been given a mandate in conjunction with his appointment. Part of that is to look into whether there was any type of conspiracy or coordination between the president's campaign and Russia's. I don't speak to that issue whatsoever. I believe that investigation should be allowed to continue. I think most Americans agree with that position, and so that'll run its course. However, under that umbrella is also the counterintelligence part of that investigation, and that's really where a lot of useful information has come out, because the full weight of the U.S. government to investigate this has been brought to bear. And you can learn a lot about what the Russians did by reading the indictments. So there's an indictment of 4 Russian generals and a number of other Russian officials, and that documents various things that were done. They were able to trace the money and so on and so forth. It was very enlightening. There's also the investigations in Congress, which have all revealed a ton of information, including all 3,500 different advertisements that were purchased on the part of the Russians and put on social media have been released as well. So I think those investigations are helpful from a counterintelligence point of view. In terms of the other stuff, I'm not going to speak to that. That's going to play itself out and so on. What the purpose of this is to recognize what was the objective, what happened, what were the tactics that were used, and how can we protect ourselves from being unduly influenced by people who are acting and using fraud to try to influence us in this new realm.
Yep. Phil Burcham.
Thanks very much. Lovely talk. Thank you very much, Ron. I'm just wondering, it seems obvious that in this sort of new global environment, we're going to need very high levels of technical competence and highly trained individuals to maintain national defences against cyber warfare. Where do you see that sort of competence being developed? In Australia, we have very significant problems with our universities, in my opinion. They've been very degraded by the left. And I just wonder how America is addressing that issue. Are you looking to private industry to develop the skill sets that are needed in this sort of environment, or the military? How are you handling that issue?
Yeah, so Silicon Valley, which is in my state, is a pretty amazing place. And part of the reason why you have so many technological innovations that are coming out of Silicon Valley is that you have this ecosystem of technological expertise and venture capital. So a lot of these venture capital guys they'll invest in 100 projects, and they know that 90 of them will fail. But they're counting on the return from that one thing that takes off, to turn into something. And other countries have tried to mimic this, but part of it is cultural. There's that entrepreneurial spirit, that spirit of risk taking, and you don't see that, for example, coming out of Europe, right? So my family's German, by ancestry, and the Germans are really great at making the thing that makes the thing, as they'll say, right? So printing press, manufacturing, so on and so forth, chemicals, so on and so forth. That's where their expertise has been. But you've not seen the type of technological innovation coming out of Europe that you've seen coming out of Silicon Valley. So I think that's that ecosystem. And you also have universities that are in that area as well to kind of feed that. Now technology has become so big that you have technology centers all over the country: Austin, Texas, North Carolina, et cetera, et cetera. So if anything, American technology companies, we don't even have enough American-born technical talent that the tech companies are always pushing for more what are called H-1B visas, so they can import people who've been educated in India, for example, and they have an advantage because they learn English, to come over. Let me make a kind of a related point that's a little broader. In order for a society to maximize its quality of life, it really depends upon innovation more than anything else. Innovation is what gives us better tools than the previous generation had, right? We're not smarter than our fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and so on. We're not smarter than the previous generation, but what we do have, we have better tools than the previous generation had. So innovation is key. How do you get innovation? You need two things: education and opportunity. And some of our friends on the left, they talk a lot about on the education side, don't necessarily get the same results, but they talk a lot on the education side. But where I think many of our friends on the left completely miss the boat is the need for opportunity as well. So I've done a lot of lecturing in Honduras, for example, which has a center-right government. And I made the point that if you were to educate every young person in Honduras to the same level of where Americans are educated, you know what they would all do? They would leave, because their country doesn't have the same opportunity that America has, right? So it's education and opportunity. What gives you opportunity? Access to a fair judicial system, stable monetary policy, rational labor policy, and so on and so forth. These are the elements that lead to prosperity. So that's why it's so important that people in this room continue to be engaged as actively as possible in terms of supporting candidates who will maximize the quality of education as well as the opportunity. And when we have our friends on the left who are pushing punitive taxes and punitive regulations and protectionist trade policies, so what they're doing is they're ratcheting down the amount of opportunity that exists in Australia, and therefore limiting the amount of innovation that will take place, and therefore limiting the future quality of life that can take place in this country. And it's the same in any country anywhere else, which is why I'm so excited to be able to spend this entire week with you and with Faye and everyone else in the Liberal Party, because we really share the same core beliefs in that entrepreneurial spirit, limited government, personal responsibility, and really that's created this incredible, think about the improvement and the quality of life that's happened in the world since the end of World War II. The great thing about being on our side, the side that we are on, is that we don't have to defend things like Venezuela. The other team has to defend stuff like that, right? We know that our ideas in the Liberal Party, in the Republican Party, in the British Conservative Party, the Canadian Conservative Party, etc., generates prosperity. If you take a country, I'll stop with this example, the most long-winded answer of the day, I'm sorry, but if you take a country with one language, one history, one culture, right? One language, one history, one culture, divide it in half. One side goes one way, one side goes the other, come back in 50 years, see what happens. It's only happened twice in all of human history, in Korea and in Germany. And I guarantee you that when that Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, there was no one in West Germany who said, thank God I can go shop in East Berlin. I'm really tired of my BMW. I want that Trabant. Right? Nobody really said that because our system's a lot better. So what did that? It's the ideas that are at the center of our party, of your party and my party, that produce that. And that's why it's so important that we continue to be engaged, that we have great party leaders, people like Faye, people like Sherry, the vice presidents of the party, et cetera, who I spent the last couple of days with. You've got a great group of leaders here. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue, and I really look forward to a Liberal majority in the next state elections here in Western Australia. So,
Hear, hear. Okay, thank you, Ron. Look, I think we're going to do two more questions. So, gentleman here at the front has had his hand up for a while. That one behind him. Yep. And then we're going to do one more after that.
Hi, Ron. Recently, U.S. authorities...
Your name?
Ashton. Recently, U.S. authorities arrested an ex-Russian spy by the name of Maria Butina for her involvement in the U.S. election. She was charged for interfering with the processes in favor of the Russian government. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on her case and for your speculative opinion on the likely outcome of her involvement. Thank you.
Yeah, so Maria Butina is a Russian spy. She's someone who has acted as an agent of the Russian government, attempting to gain influence within the broader conservative movement, specifically in the National Rifle Association. She purported to have a Russian gun rights group, which is hilarious because there are no gun rights in Russia. So, that was kind of glossed over. Assuming that the charges are true, which, in America you're innocent until proven guilty. So, we'll see what the courts have to say, that if she was fraudulently, misrepresenting herself, and she should be held accountable for her actions. But certainly in the view of the U.S. government, which has charged her with multiple crimes, she was acting, as a foreign agent and violating U.S. laws, to that end. So, if you're going to violate U.S. laws, you should be held accountable. And I think that's something which, by the way, we will take much more seriously in our country. We have something called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, in America, that if you are hired by a foreign entity to try to influence people and lobby Congress and things like that, you have to file disclosure reports, and all the printed stuff you hand out has to have a disclaimer at the bottom saying who is ultimately paid for that. So it would appear that this is someone who's who's violated the law and will be held accountable.
Okay, we're going to take the last question for the evening. This gentleman here at the front.
Thanks very much, Ron. Your global picture is very concerning, and I understand where you're coming from. One of the biggest problems for all these people here, and a lot of Australians, is the invasion we're getting from third world countries, either from telephone, emails, and they're extracting millions of dollars of people's life saving and become destitute. How can we avoid this gullibility of our population being saturated by this global picture that you've shown, and now we've got individuals that get absorbed in that? Is it through education? What do we do with this? How can we change? And it's all Western democracies that are being attacked.
So I have stopped sending money to the Nigerian princes, who've emailed me. Right, so I don't do that anymore. But look, we have to be, every time technology takes a leap, the scammers take a leap too, right? So there's telemarketing scams, there's email scams, there's all these scams out there. And we have to be a little more skeptical. So when you get an email from someone saying, I've hidden $24 million in an account, and I need an Australian account that I can move it into. Would you please help me, and I'll pay you a handsome commission on this? It's probably not true, right? So this is, not a big leap in that regard. But likewise, when you see somebody on Facebook sharing something from a website you've never heard of, making some bizarre claim, you should be a little more skeptical of that as well. This is kind of new territory that we're moving into. And, I don't want to see anyone in this room become a victim of some type of online scam, whether it's a spear phishing, attack, whether it's identity theft, whether it's, someone taking out a loan in your name, because they got information from you. Think about it. Part of the spear phishing, so spear phishing again is when someone targets you individually. So, some of these are fairly sophisticated, right? So you can go on social media, for example, and say, oh, it appears that Sherry's bought a new car. He bought a brand new Maserati. So I'm going to create an email that comes from Maserati Motor Credit, right? And I'm going to borrow the Maserati graphics from the Maserati website. And I have his email, so I have his email address, and I know from his Instagram account that he's got a new Maserati. He doesn't have any Maserati, but he deserves one.
One day.
I know from his Instagram account because
the Leadership Institute can sponsor one.
Right. Don't hold your breath. So I know from his Instagram account because he posted a picture of himself with that, for example, and I'm going to register MaseratiMotorCredit.com, but the I's are ones, right? So I'm going to go online, I'm going to register that domain, I'm going to create a link, I'm going to create an email, I'm going to send it to him, and it's going to say, there's a problem with your car finance account, your vehicle is at risk of being impounded. Click here to read this important message on your account. And he clicks that link, and all of a sudden it takes him to some phony page, and he has to log in, right? So he types in the name and password for his Maserati Motor Credit account, and what has he done? He's given it to someone else, and now they have access to his private information. We don't want to see anyone become a victim of that. So at a minimum, what we've done is I hope we raised your sensitivity to be very careful about anything you get in your inbox. It may not be as obvious as coming from some Nigerian prince, but it may look completely legitimate, and we should be conscious of that, and we should practice good online best practices to protect ourselves.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Ron, for that fascinating presentation. And thanks to all of you too. I mean, I know that it takes a certain amount of patience to sit through presentations like these, but I certainly hope that you all thought it was worth it. Now, like I said before, I'm going to stress this one more time. We are a volunteer organisation. We don't charge for the events that we organise. We want to continue to remain committed to delivering you quality events like the one you've experienced tonight. So there are donation slips around. Be generous and go on our website, waliberal.org.au /donate. Now, I do want to acknowledge and thank our State Director, Sam Calabrese, who I know has been running around the whole time at the back somewhere. He works very hard day and night. Sam, hello. And I think a big round of applause for our State Director, please. He's the brains behind the party, and without all of his efforts, I don't think we'd be able to achieve the things that we do, including putting together an event like this. So I want to call on stage to do an official vote of thanks to the person without whom this event wouldn't have happened, because our state president, Faye Duda, is the one who actually met Ron at an International Democratic Union conference a year or so ago in Madrid in Spain. And she came back and she couldn't stop talking about Ron. And so I went and checked the guy out on Google, and here he is. He's traveled a very long distance, and I hope that you all agree that it's been worth it. So, Faye Duda, our state president.
Well, look, thank you everyone for coming. As Sherry said, I did meet Ron. It was in Spain approximately 12 months ago, in fact. And the presentation he gave were to about 150 people from the IDU, which are conservative right parties from around the world, all different countries. And I can tell you the presentation that he gave tonight is the one I heard, and I just sat there and I thought, I have to get this man out to Perth. One of the greatest communicators that I have heard. As a strategist, obviously Ron has a world reputation for going into countries, helping them with governance, helping them with campaigns. And I think we're very privileged to have Ron here, and I really want to thank him. I've worked this week with Sherry and with Sam and with Ron, and I can tell you Ron has met with our young Liberals, had some chats about leadership. He's also met with our campaign teams, did some campaign training last night. He's here tonight with you. Tomorrow he's doing a session down at the US Asia Centre. On Thursday he's doing the 500 Club. Friday he's flying to Albany to address the state parliamentary team who are down there for their annual love-in. And on Saturday he's addressing State Council in Albany. So not much time in between, but
It's the last time I have you put the agenda together. It's a very hard week of work here.
I have to say he's been really cool about everything that we've asked him to do, including media that he's done for us, and absolutely one of the easiest people that I've ever worked on in campaign or otherwise. So Ron, thank you so much.